Hey, what's happening, folks? This is the Negro Subversive podcast, our first episode. And in this first episode, we're going to talk about black separatism. As I'm sure most of you know, or many of you may know, Charles Blow has recently written a book called The Devil You Know. In this book, he argues that black Americans should migrate to several southern states in order to take them over. Blow, in this book, engages several ideas that I've had for quite a while. I've long argued that Africans in America need to establish our own separate territory from the United States. Blow does not argue this. He specifically says he's not arguing it. His idea is that we take over states within the United States and stay within the United States. I'm going to talk more about Blow's book in the third installment of this opening series on black separatism, but I just want to start off by saying that if we can get these states and exist peacefully and productively in this region, then I'm perfectly fine with us staying in the country. Because I recognize that becoming separated will involve a lot of struggle. And if we can be prosperous and achieve the height of our potential without full separation, I'm not going to argue against that. Maybe we could even become a semi-autonomous region within the United States. There are many options. But I don't think we actually will be able to just establish this region of states and stay in the country. Because I think what will end up happening is that once we are absent from the rest of the country will be able to drop the veneer of not being violently anti-black and develop fully into its racial antagonism towards us. What I mean by this is the flip side of all of us being concentrated in one region, or the vast majority of us being concentrated in one region, is that the black population of the rest of the country will have to go down. As of right now, in most of the most densely populated areas of the country, and even in areas that aren't that densely populated, you can't function as a normal adult without knowing how to pretend you don't hate black Africans. Our presence in the rest of the country, combined with social changes we have forced into being through protest, have forced a level of accommodation to us, at least on the surface. Once the average person outside of our southern region no longer has to interact with us on a daily basis, I think we'll begin to see a backslide in terms of norms around race in general, and particularly with regard to us. Even though the United States as a whole will be a majority-minority country within the next few decades, if you take black Africans out of the equation for most of the country, that makes the rest of the country outside of our region even whiter. And when you consider that about a half of the Hispanic and Latino population identifies as white, it becomes clear that America will continue to be very white and will be dominated by an overwhelming anti-black majority. And again, this will only be exacerbated by us being concentrated in one region. Some may argue that this is an argument against us concentrating in one region, but I don't think being able to keep some random middle manager in Michigan from using racial slurs in the workplace is worth being shut out from substantial group power by being a minority spread out thinly across the country. I think this regional move will exacerbate the underlying, not just racism, but specifically anti-black, anti-African racism. I think on our side, we will also exacerbate it because just as most of the rest of the country has learned to accommodate us, we've also learned to accommodate it. In fact, I would argue we've been accommodating them more than they've been accommodating us. Even if you take racism, the racism we have to tolerate out of the equation, even though we still have our own separate culture that is different from the mainstream, because we consume their media and we have to deal with them in the workplace for the most part and in a subordinate position, and we go to schools directly that they, the white majority, run, that dampens our own cultural development. We can talk about, for instance, AAVE, African American Vernacular English, or as some folks prefer it, Ebonics, which I personally think sounds more natural, but AAVE is the standard at the moment, so I'll go with that. Imagine how it would develop if we did not have to code switch. Imagine if from birth you had African American Vernacular English, AAVE, Ebonics, being spoken on television and in schools, in boardrooms, etc. Folks might learn so-called standard English as a foreign language in case you have to leave and go other places. And of course, many of the iconic works of our cultural history are written in so-called standard English. So I think so-called standard English would be something that most of us would at least be familiar with. But I think it would increasingly become like Latin, where it's learned as part of education but not used in everyday life. And most importantly, it wouldn't be taught as a superior form of speech, but just as a language that is used most generally by English speakers around the world. It would just be a language, the form of English that is used by English speakers mostly around the world. It'd be the most common form of English is what I'm saying. And I could even see a scenario where we translate the works of our ancestors that were in English into AAVE. I think if you get rid of code switching, and by the way, when folks talk about code switching, and that's a whole other topic I could get into in another episode, but when folks talk about code switching, most often they're talking about doing it verbally. So you talk one way most of the time, and you talk another way when the bill collector calls or something. But there's also code switching to be able to decode standard English. So every time you watch TV with folks talking in white English instead of black English, you code switch them. I'm trying to see us develop a new orthography. Orthography, that's just the way that you turn a spoken language into a written language. It's the system of sounds. So I'm trying to see us develop a new orthography and a new written version of how we talk, the language of our West African nation, which is captured in the United States of America. And if we get together, and if we get that together, we could translate the works of Du Bois, the autobiography of Malcolm X, the works of Baldwin, etc., into AAVE. I could see us teaching our children African languages: Swahili, Hausa, Yoruba, West African Pidgin, etc., and even New World African languages like Haitian Creole. And then when you have a large group of people who speak these various languages, you're more likely to see loan words moving back and forth between them, which would tend to further widen the gulf between the languages of African America and the languages of European America. I've often pointed out that I have yet to meet an African of the continent who only spoke one language. The African gift for multilingualism is something I would argue that we already exhibit in African America through our ability to code switch. And I think we could build upon that by teaching the language of the African world to our children in schools we control in a region we control. And again, even beyond languages, if you encounter people who live in predominantly black spaces and places versus people who live in places that are not predominantly black, they have a different way of moving through the world that is obvious. So basically, in every way that you can think of, when you have two groups of people who no longer consume the same media and don't inhabit the same spaces and institutions, there is going to be a widening gulf in terms of cultural distinctiveness. And when you think about how we've been able to build different cultures just living in segregated neighborhoods in the same city, and working under this, and even working under the supervision of the white majority for the most part, the sky's the limit in terms of what we can look forward to with increased regional separatism. When you pile on top of all this the reality of anti-blackness in the dominant culture, that just exacerbates it further. Part of the way anti-black racism functions is by categorizing anything the black folk do that deviates from this some so-called mainstream standard as inferior. Anything we do that deviates from some kind of so-called mainstream standard gets coded as inferior. I remember back in high school, one of the most inspiring moments for me was when the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, or the Jeremiah Wright controversy happened. And instead of hiding, Reverend Wright, it seemed to me, basically commandeered the American media landscape for a couple of days. It just so happened that he was giving a speech in front of the NAACP, and I remember him talking about black American culture and using the phrase, different does not mean deficient. And that has always stuck with me. But when it comes to people of African descent and the way we're viewed by the wider culture, the dominant culture, the colonizing culture, when you assume a group of people are inferior, then there's a tendency to code any differences they have from the mainstream as deficient. So as a culture deviates from another culture that is assumed to be superior to it, because the people who created culture A are assumed to be superior to the people who created culture B, which has different norms, then the existence of that difference, that deviation, becomes further evidence of culture B's inferiority, of the subjugated and oppressed group's inferiority. It's like a closed circle. Your differences are deficient because you're deficient. And one of the ways we know you're deficient is because your culture is deficient. And we know your culture is deficient because you're deficient. And it's just a perfectly closed circle that logic, reason, and facts cannot ever hope to penetrate. And so, as we become increasingly different and are increasingly perceived as a foreign element, and as we no longer feel like we have to make ourselves conform to the mainstream, because now we're in our space and can do whatever the hell we want, we'll become less tolerant of any form of repression. We will get out of this defensive, lowballing, small-thinking, afraid mindset that many of us have, which has been brutally and systematically conditioned into us over the course of 401 years. I kind of glossed over us having our own media, But a region of 7 states and more than 45 million people will, of course, have its own media markets. By the way, it just occurred to me, I did not specify the states that I'm looking at that I think we should look to take over. Specifically North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. That's actually 6 states. So yeah, so 6 states with over 45 million people in them will have its own media markets. We'll also be able to produce our own textbooks. We'll basically be able to build our own media and intellectual landscape. That includes academics. Currently, you have black academics. Most of the most prominent ones are graduates of white universities and depend on a white publishing industry and white academia to approve and promote them. Some of them, who will remain nameless, find themselves shuttling back and forth between white institutions. When they can't get tenure at one, they go to a slightly less prestigious one, and then they go back to the other one eventually. So it's this, you're moving around between different big houses, between different plantations. But I'm not going to name anybody who has that dynamic. Let's see. We'll have our own publishing industry, etc. And again, that will make us seem like a foreign element on the one hand, and make us less likely to buy into the mainstream narratives on the other hand. So just to summarize, we'll be even more assertive, and on the other hand, on the one hand, we'll be even more assertive because we'll get out of the habit of bowing because we won't have to use it as much. And on the other hand, the rest of the country will find us less familiar and will hate us more because they'll be out of the habit of pretending they don't. I also think it's likely that the majority of the rest of the country will try to establish a quasi-colonial relationship with us. As things currently stand, the South is one of the least productive regions, and if the majority of the country sees itself as the real America and sees us as a deficient, inferior foreign element, they're very unlikely to support, promote, or even tolerate our own economic, social, and political prosperity and development. And so I think there will come a point where our well-being, our escape from the shackles of degradation, our self-assertion, our pride, our dignity, and yes, our new black power, our escape from the mental and physical shackles which white supremacy has weighed us down with for 400 years. These shackles that we were supposed to suffer, bleed, and die in will be seen as antagonistic. And we already know how this works. The well-being of the United States and our well-being are thought of as not being the same thing. That's why when we try to stand up straight on our own, we get repressed. And when we ask for assistance or just basic reasonable treatment in the most powerful nation in human history, we get ignored. And again, this dynamic will only be enhanced by us having control of a set of states and their economies and political and social institutions. That is why I think that a necessary component of us achieving either regional autonomy or separatism, even before we start talking about trying to create our own separate sovereign territory outside the United States, has to be Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism has to be a part of it, and that's not just building connections with the African continent, though that is always the core of the African world, and that's where the vast majority of the African people on this earth reside, but also with the rest of the African diaspora, particularly in this hemisphere. If you just look geographically at where these states are, they border the southern Atlantic Ocean. you have the Black Caribbean, and then south of them you have Brazil, which has more people of Black African descent in it than any country outside of Africa itself. We have Cuba, which is believed to be majority Black at this point, and then in addition to that, you have the entire African continent on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Even if state governments are not allowed to make treaties with other countries, companies can ally with other companies. Universities can ally with other universities. Individuals can ally with other individuals. Organizations can ally with other organizations, etc. We can forge social, political, cultural, intellectual ties around the African world that can help lift us all up. And an empowered African world will give us alliances with newly empowered friends who can help us maintain and assert our interests against an anti-Black society that will no doubt be attempting to keep us under its thumb, even as we attempt to establish regional economic prosperity. Finally, in order to reason and analyze reality the way we need to, we must change the way we think about history and the idea of progress. Back in 2018, I wrote a blog post entitled, "Why I'm a Black Separatist," in which I laid out 14 theses of Black history that most of us take for granted, without even realizing it. These theses, these taken for granted ideas, are the cornerstone and pillars of what I call the integrationist, assimilationist vision and theory of Black history. This matters because how we think about history determines how we think about our present and the future. In the next episode, I will look at these theses because as we begin to move forward toward more autonomy and independence, I'm certain the mainstream will begin to use the integrationist ideology and its designated liberal shills. They'll use this integrationist ideology that we've been conditioned into to turn us away from an empowered, independent future. But this isn't, by a long shot, the only area where we need to reconsider ideological frameworks in order to build a better world for ourselves and our descendants. I'm also going to lay out frameworks for political, economic, and social reorganization. Because once we open this door, the sky is the limit, and we can certainly do better than to just replicate the American ideology with Black folks in charge of it. And not only can we do better, but developing new ways to organize our lives is essential to not replicating the mistakes and exploitations of the past. As I said, this episode is up. The next 2 episodes are up if you want to dive into them. This has been the first episode of the Negro Subversive podcast. Thanks for listening. I hope we can keep meeting like this. The black skin is not a badge of shame, but a glorious symbol of national greatness. We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into being by any means necessary. wasn't obvious, the first quote was Marcus Garvey, second quote Malcolm X. This is, once again, the Negro Subversive Podcast, signing off for the first time. Thanks for listening.